you very much. Ryan, it's a pleasure to be here. I greet everyone, and I thank you for the kind invitation. I have divided my initial remarks in three very brief chapters. First one is the digital revolution and the rise of social media. The second one is the phenomenon of disinformation and the means to face it. And the third one is the strategies adopted by the Brazilian Superior Electoral Court to deal with the problem. So starting with the digital revolution, we are all living under the third industrial revolution, which is the digital or technological revolution characterized by the massification of personal computers, of smart cell phones, and particularly the internet, connecting billions of people around the world. The internet has revolutionized the world of interpersonal and social communication, expanding exponentially the access to information, to knowledge, and to the public sphere. These days, anyone can talk to the world, conveying his or her opinions and conveying facts and ideas. The downside of the process is that it has also created an environment where crimes can be carried out, along with the propagation of hate speech, conspiracy theories, and disinformation or misinformation campaigns that have been nicknamed fake news. One of the most striking consequences of the digital revolution is the appearance of social media and messaging apps. Facebook these days has more than 3 billion accounts. YouTube has around 2.5 billion users, and WhatsApp over 2 billion. In Brazil, according to a survey conducted by the Senate, 79% of the population has WhatsApp as its main source of information. Television coming in second place with 50%, followed closely by YouTube and Facebook. As you all know, at the beginning, there was a belief that the internet and the social media should be a space free from regulation, either economic, commercial, and the only perspective was preserving free speech. As you might remember, free, open, and unregulated were often repeated words. And I don't need to tell you all that this perception has changed dramatically. So this is our first brief chapter. Our second brief chapter deals with disinformation and social media control. So nowadays, there is a consensus that internet needs some sort of regulation dealing with economic issues like preserving copyrights, like finding the proper taxation for internet and applying antitrust legislation. The internet needs regulation to protect our rights of privacy, and there have been enacted laws dealing with this problem throughout the world. And the third consensus is that we need some kind of content control, and we need to establish some platform liability rules. And of course, when we talk about content control, we need to be aware of the importance of free speech for democracy, and thus finding the proper balance is something that we are all paying attention right now. The regulation of social media should seek to curb unauthentic behavior in the first place, like the use of robos and trolls to make everyone think that everyone is talking about that issue at a certain moment. In the second place, We need to fight illicit content like terrorism, child abuse, and other crimes you can commit online. And finally, and that's the point that interests us the most, we need to fight disinformation, meaning the deliberate creation of and dissemination of false news, generally with the purpose of obtaining personal gain. So the whole world right now is trying to find the best way to regulate the internet and social media and messaging apps, and trying to strike a balance between legislation, between self-regulation, and between regulated self-regulation. And there is a certain consensus, I think, that the proper criteria for moderating content must include transparency, must include due process, and must include fairness. I'm not getting into details right now because Brian asked me to leave some time for a debate and exchange of ideas. So I'm being very brief. And so I get to my third chapter, which is the strategies adopted by the Superior Electoral Court of Brazil to deal with disinformation. Superior Electoral Court, the acronym is TSE, so I'm going to use it for short. I would like to start with the 2018 elections because those elections changed the pattern of the electoral scenario in Brazil. Until then, as many of you might know, access to television and radio, which is free in Brazil during the campaign, was the main feature of a campaign. And alliances were made and established so that the candidate would get the most time on radio and television. Well, in 2018, the candidate that had the longest period online placed fourth, as you all know. And something new happened in those elections. The winning candidate was the beneficiary of a great strategy of using social media and messaging apps. Such strategy included bulk messaging at voters, unsolicited, by the way, and along with spreading negative news about other candidates. And the truth is that the legislation, the case law, and the TSE were not prepared to deal with this situation, with this new reality, which also included attacks against the electoral system, which ultimately meant attacks on democracy. So when the 2020 elections came, Brian and everyone, we had done our homework and learned at least part of the lesson, and we prepared for a warfare operation against disinformation. We prepared for a warfare because first we had to convince people to come and vote in the midst of a pandemic. That was the first challenge. The second was to elaborate a health and sanitary plan and distribute protection equipments all over Brazil, which was no easy task, believe me. And in the third place, we prepared a very comprehensive plan to combat disinformation, especially the disinformation that aimed at the electoral process. And our program had three main axes: fighting information with accurate information and immediate responses. That was the first axis. The second axis was our priority was to focus on authentic behaviors rather than in content. And in the third place, media education of society. I'll mention very briefly a couple features of each of these axes, and then I'll close so that we have some time. As for the massive disclosure of true information, I always like to recall a quote by Christina Targacla that's here with us. The best way to fight disinformation is flooding the market with accurate information. And we entered partnerships with all technological platforms with customized concrete action by each one of them. We entered partnerships with all major fact-checking agencies so that they could verify information and debunk fake news. And we created a page called Fact or Rumor at the Electoral Justice website, where we would convey truthful information that had been checked by the fact-checking agencies. We entered a partnership with all telecom companies so that people would have access to this page without having to pay a zero rating deal. And we had an agreement with all the platforms that they would give visibility to the link to our page that in fact had millions of accesses. As for control of unauthentic behaviors, our second axis, we entered equally partnership with all the platforms, and especially WhatsApp, which, as I mentioned, is very important in Brazil. And indeed, they banned 360,000 accounts for unauthentic behavior. We had a direct channel with WhatsApp for denouncing unauthentic behavior, and we created a coordination unit to combat disinformation. So we monitor the social media, and we would immediately respond to any fake news. And as for media education, we held a major campaign with a famous biologist and YouTuber that was on television and on radio for several weeks. And I myself recorded several videos that were broadcasting in social media, explaining what fake news were and how to avoid disseminating it. So, Brian, this is very briefly, as you asked me, some comments I could make on how I see the problem of disinformation and how we try to fight it. And we do think that we won temporarily, at least, this fight. Of course, you don't eliminate fake news, but we were able to get 113 million people to vote in the midst of a pandemic. And I think we preserved, to the largest extent possible, the credibility of the system. And just to end, the president started the attacks against the system after the elections. And we think that we were able to win this battle also, not going back to paper vote, which has always been the proper scenario for frauds in Brazil. And according to Datafolha, 73% of the population rely on our electoral system, which is a pretty good achievement considering that for weeks, the president attacked every day the system, the electoral justice, and myself. So that's it to start with.
All right. Well, Minister Barroso, thank you so much for your thoughtful remarks. And what's clear is the determination of the authorities in Brazil to prevent these attacks on democratic institutions, on the confidence in the electoral system. And that, I think it's fair to say, is different from the posture that authorities had back in 2018, when some people criticized the Brazilian authorities for being too passive in the face of all of this kind of fake news and misinformation. You mentioned during your open remarks the balance between what you called content control and then the concerns about potentially infringing on free speech. And I tell you, I mean, we spent the last 3 months looking at this issue, and it's just so complex, because if you give a lot of power to governments to make these decisions, then you run the obvious risk of silencing dissent. If you rely too heavily on companies to do it, I mean, that's an awful lot of power that goes to the private sector. So my question is, who in your mind, what mix of policies are necessary in order to achieve the best balance between those two factors?
Well, Brian, I live in Brazil, and so the ghost of my generation is censorship and government censorship. So we are very cautious when we deal with this issue, and we want as little state as possible in this matter, and as much as possible of regulated self-regulation. So I think we should have a legal framework, and then I think the platforms should be in charge of implementing these measures. And I would think, and that's a suggestion of my daughter, Luna Barroso, is studying this matter and has just published her thesis on creating an independent agency, but really independent, including from the government. The government would have a representative, but it would not be the majority. And so we would have an independent agency monitoring the platforms to make sure that they are abiding by the legislation. And as I mentioned before, Brian, I think for moderating content, transparency is very important. So the terms of use should be very objective on the criteria they're going to be using. There should be some sort of due process, like I could appeal my banning of the internet, for example. And in the third place, it needs to be fair. Like you can't discriminate on political preferences or on sexual orientation, for example. So transparency, due process, and fairness within a framework defined by the government and monitored by an independent agency, I think would be a good idea to deal with this problem.
Another question, Minister, and this may be my last one, just because unfortunately we're out of time for this initial part of our event. But as someone who watches Brazil a lot, as you know, it seems like there's been an effort, even in the last few weeks, to try to build a certain jurisprudence on some of these issues ahead of the 2022 elections. One of your colleagues on the Supreme Court has spoken about using imprisonment potentially as a tool for those who disseminate this bulk messaging that was a feature of the 2018 election that you mentioned during your initial comments. There have also been efforts to imprison some call him a blogger, some call him an influencer associated with the current government. And my question is, is prison, do you think it's an effective tool for punishing some of these transgressions when people are serially sharing fake news? Because I again, on this balance between freedom of speech and preventing this fake news, I have to confess, it makes me a little bit nervous when we start talking about jail time for people as a result of sharing fake news.
Brian, I'm not very fond of criminal law to deal with certain issues, and especially issues that involve free speech. So I would say criminal law should be the last resort. My colleague was possibly mentioning the scenario that we faced in Brazil with very strong, articulated, and funded attacks against democracy, and for the closure of the Supreme Court and the closure of the Congress, and personal attacks to the justices. So I think he might be referring to something more serious when he mentioned that, but you would need to ask him. But I do think that the electoral court should, and we sent this sign, enforce very strictly the prohibition of bulk messages, especially containing fake news, and particularly against the electoral system. And that could lead to the cassação, to the loss of the mandate by whoever is elected. So I think we should again prepare for a war, and criminal law, I don't think, should be the main resource. It should be the last resort in extreme cases, but I do think we need to be strict. The major problem, as we all know here, is that it's not always easy and clear to establish what's fake news and what's disinformation. So we need to be very careful because we want a free and robust debate during the elections. So we are more concerned, Brian, about protecting the electoral system and democracy more than controlling the exchange of offenses, maybe, or whatever, between candidates. So our main goal is to protect democracy and the reliability of the electoral system. To avoid fake news among candidates, the electoral justice has a proper procedure that you can file a complaint in case of fake news being directed against you. So these are two things that we need to clearly separate: protecting democracy and the reliability of the system, but allowing a free, robust debate that we want to interfere as little as possible.
I do have one more quick question, and we'll extend the event a little bit at the end if we have to. Mr. Barroso, you're a citizen of the world. You speak this exceptional English, which as somebody who tries to, speak Portuguese, it makes me embarrassed to hear how good your English is. But I mention this because none of this is taking place in a vacuum. And my question is, as you look around the world, is there any country or any environment that you think Brazil should try to follow? Is there any example elsewhere in the world where someone has successfully faced these issues, or do you think it's left to Brazil for kind of reasons for domestic reasons to be a pioneer on this issue?
I think we have been, Brian, a laboratory for many things, many ideas, including in judicial review and what we call constitutional jurisdiction. And I think in this matter, we are going to be the laboratory too. I think there are, if you look quickly, two extreme ways of holding platforms liable. The tendency in Europe, and I think in Germany, to hold the platform liable as soon as the interested party notifies the platform that something is untruthful and needs to be removed. And we have this Brazilian system, or you have the other extreme, the US system, in which, as far as I know, never there's been a court order determining the removal of any content. And in Brazil, we have this Marco Civil da Internet, which establishes that the platform should remove content after the first court order, except in a few cases, or actually except in one case, which is porn revenge. I think the only thing I would consider would be to enlarge a little bit the list of removals that should be taken down after the first notification of the interested party. But as a system, I do like the Brazilian system that is only after a court order, and I would just contemplate a few exceptions. How this is going to play out in an election like the disputed election in 2022, let's wait and see. But we're trying, again, to enter agreements, detailed agreements, with all the platforms to have clear criteria to avoid unauthentic behaviors and to remove content as fast as possible. I thought the experience we had with some of them of a direct channel by which the electoral court would ask for the removal, not exactly a court order, but just a communication that there seems to be something wrong. Please give a special consideration here. That could be a good idea also.
Minister Barroso, thank you so much for your thoughtful remarks, for your frank and direct answers, and for being with us today. You are, of course, more than welcome to stick around if your schedule permits as we move into the next portion of our event now, which is the panel.
I'll stay
Thank
10
you
more
so much.
and then I'll have to. Can I just exit without affecting the? Because I'm a co-host, right?
But yeah, that is a good question. There was some technical talk about that beforehand.
Okay,
I think
I'll
that
stay as
you
long as
can.
I can, and I'll stop the video and mute here. Don't worry. I won't.
Sounds good.
I won't
These are
take
the technical challenges that we have to face in late 2021. We'll see if maybe one of my colleagues can message you with specific instructions to ensure that we don't hold you prisoner for the next 40 minutes, although for what I'm sure will be a great discussion. So thank you, Minister Barroso, for joining us. We'd now like to go to what is an excellent